All right, let's get started. Nice to meet everyone. Hi, it's good to see everyone. Welcome to the talk, How to Make Career Decisions. My name is Daniel. Sorry, just to get the admin out of the way. Um, I have about 15 minutes of content prepared and hoping to have the remaining time in the Q&A section. So if throughout the chat, if you guys could use the Q&A or the chat to ask a bunch of questions, then we can kind of go through those step by step and during the Q&A session. That would be helpful. Cool. So related to the talk, my name is Daniel. I had a chance to work on multiple careers throughout my life and wanted to share how I made that. So careers include, I could have been I'm a licensed pilot. I was a strategy consultant working at a firm called the Boston Consulting Group and Oliver Wyman. I was also a venture capitalist at a venture fund called SoftBank Vision Fund, which at the time was the largest venture capital fund in the world. And currently, I'm a founder backed by an accelerator called Y Combinator. So in today's topic, I wanted to talk about how I used the framework that I used to make my personal career decisions, and hopefully it will help you kind of make yours too, or at least be one framework that you consider as you make them. So I'll cover kind of three major things today as part of this framework. The first is thinking like an investor, and that is forecasting possible outcomes of options. The second is optimizing those scenarios. And finally, the last is picking the right option set. So when it comes to choices, we have to make them because we don't have unlimited resources and time, right? So there's always going to be an opportunity cost, particularly if it's an irreversible decision. And when investors make decisions like this, that is very challenging to reverse, we always think and try to forecast different scenarios that'll happen. So if I have an option between A and B, we don't just have a pros and cons list of we could do A or we could do B. We try to forecast out if we took B, what would happen in the future and what are the scenarios in which that would happen. Like a classic example, for example, is when I was at SoftBank and trying to leave SoftBank to start my own company. I wouldn't say option A, staying at SoftBank, and option B, starting a company, pros and cons. I'd say, let's say I were to start a company and take that option. What is sort of the upside case that'll happen? Like what's the very best thing within reasonable probability it would happen? What's the expectation, like what would actually happen in my best estimate, and what would be like the worst case scenario? And I think projecting your option this way and forecasting different scenario helps in two ways. The first is you have a precise view of the actual events that will occur. So it's not vaguely in your mind of, well, like, I guess if I were to stay here, I would get promoted in X years, right? Like it takes into account a precise set of scenarios of like what could actually occur, and your margin of error become very clear. The second thing is actually reduces decision anxiety from uncertainty. So a lot of people are afraid to make choices because they don't know what the actual downside is going to be. And going through this exercise and saying, in the worst case scenario, this is what will happen, and I can or cannot deal with this, actually makes it very easy to go do this. So when I was thinking about making a decision to leave SoftBank, which was, paying me very well, I enjoyed the job, with a lot of fun, but I wanted to go start my own company. I kind of thought through both of these. And if you try to graphically represent what this looks like, SoftBank probably had a lower variance than doing a startup. What that means is the upside was probably lower than starting a company, but the downside was also probably lower than starting a company, right? The worst case scenario for me to go is quit my job, go do a startup, and then basically run out of savings after 12 to 24 months. And that would be like not ideal. But at least I know that in the worst case scenario, like I know what the outcome is. I work on something, paying myself next to nothing, living off my savings for 12 to 24 months. And that's probably as bad as it's going to get. So that's sort of what I understand. But if you stop here, it would just be a pretty irresponsible thing. And I would actually think it makes you make poor decisions when it comes to career, or at least I found it that way. What helped me then, the natural inclination was for me to then optimize the scenarios before I act upon it. And by optimize, I mean two things. Like, can I floor the downside at a lower floor? Like, can I not burn through all of my savings while doing the startup? And then how do I maximize the probability of that upside, which is, getting to a very large company? So when I talk about flooring, I always think about, is the worst case scenario something that I'm willing to tolerate? right? And if I'm willing to tolerate that, then at least I know that I'm able to make this call. So as I always say, the downside of doing a startup should not be probably, living on the streets, or your family, living on the streets. That probably shouldn't be the worst case scenario that you have option. And when it comes to flooring, I typically try to do two things to floor that downside. First is buying options ahead of time. So even when I joined SoftBank for the first time, so I had a career in management consulting, and then after I joined SoftBank, when I joined SoftBank, SoftBank was a newly formed fund. I got my offer in late 2018. I think it started mid 2018. So it's still a pretty risky company. So what I ended up doing is I bought an option. And the way I bought an option is I applied to grad school. And I knew that if SoftBank didn't work out for some whatever reason, maybe the fund shuts down, or maybe the reputation is bad, or whatever the case may be, or maybe I get even fired. I bought an option by applying to grad school, and in that time horizon, I'm able to go to school if that's the case. Now, because I had bought this option, when I was leaving SoftBank to go start my company, I could exercise this option. That was my floor. For example, instead of just quitting and starting a company right away, I could go to grad school and then start my company during grad school, in which case, the worst case scenario after 12 months is that I end up with a graduate degree, in this case from the University of Oxford. That's a pretty good downside. The other thing that I try to do is have a timeline or a milestone base to reduce variance as much as you can. And you can intuitively understand how this works. So if you project a future of doing a startup, and you project the upside over the next 5 years, and then project the downside over the next 5 years, the variance is really high. But what if you can dampen both of those things by saying, I'm only going to do it for 12 months? Or in my case, I said, if I can raise a pre-seed round where I can pay myself and work on the product in the next 10 months, then I will do this full-time after graduating, which is kind of exactly what happened. So I started my company in March of 2021, and then I raised in April of 2021. I got very lucky. So I was able to do that. So I try to floor my downside. So even if I wasn't able to do that, I know that after 10 months, I would walk away, and I know exactly what that scenario is going to look like. The other thing to do when it comes to optimization is maximizing the upside as much as I can, right? If the maximal upside of doing a startup, and in my case, in a 1-year horizon, was to raise capital to be able to pay myself and work and build a product. What I also did throughout my graduate degree for that year was apply to a bunch of accelerators. I think I applied to 7 or 8. And I got into one of them. In this case, I got into, I think, a few of them, and I ended up choosing Y Combinator at the end. The other thing that I did was I set up about 160 meetings for my pre-seed round, 160 meetings with venture capitalists. And I went to go do that. To take that, and eventually I was able to read the pre-seed even before I got into Y Combinator. So this is maximizing the upside. But the reason this is important is, let's say my upside didn't happen. My downside is floored by getting a degree from Oxford and then getting another job afterward within a 10-month period. What I don't want is leaving this company and then working on it for an endless period of time and burning through all of my savings. So if the downside was burning through all my savings, I kind of went back and placed that up there. And when it comes to this sort of hedging, flooring the downside and optimizing for the upside, there are many, many ways to do it, right? Another approach that I could have taken is asking for a return offer after I go away, go do a grad degree. Another thing that I could have done is ask for a sabbatical for 3 to 6 months and try something out. There are many ways to do this. The most common way is to actually do something on the side until it picks up. But for me, working 70, 80 hours a week as an investor, that was not an option I had at the time. So that's going to be the important piece. The final piece I'll kind of end with when it comes to making these career decisions, and in that framework of, you've now taken options, you've forecasted what is the uncapped upside, what you expect to happen, and what's the downside. You want to try to find the right set of options to play around with to maximize your luck. I'll be in the next session, I'm going to be talking about that. And that graph is going to look something like this. So if we have a graph that looks like this, the upside is going to look exponential and it's going to get uncapped like that. The base is going to still help you get to where you want to, and the downside will be absolutely floored to a point where it's actually it's a risk that you're willing to tolerate. And if you're able to get as many of these decisions as possible. And it doesn't have to be like large full-time career decisions. Only a few of these actually have to pop for it to be worth it. Like, for example, writing on Medium was one of these things that I said. I said, well, I'm going to dedicate, I only publish once a month. I'm going to dedicate a little bit of time, write about my startup experience. The worst case scenario is that I spent 8 hours this month or like 6 hours this month writing this piece. The upside is that I'm able to generate money from this and ultimately maybe like publish into a book at some point, right? And right now, like on Medium, I'm able to generate about $2,000 a month just from the Medium income itself, beyond all of the speaking things that come along with it. So all this to say, try to fit graphs in your mind that would say, what is the uncapped upside? Can I floor the downside? And I'll try to do as many of these as possible, as long as it doesn't interfere with my core things of what I'm doing in my life. And hopefully, a few of these will land, and that's really all you need to have a really successful career. And this, I think, applies to things outside of careers as well. If you want to take your hack at being a creator, take your hack at being a startup founder, there's a few careers that are out there with almost uncapped potential and a floored downside. So that's how I kind of made my own career decision as a very risk-averse person. I'm trying to navigate my careers. Happy to answer, sort of like dive into the Q&A at this point. Happy to talk about, like what it's like to be a VC, startup founder, a management consultant, how to make decisions, and so on and so forth. So feel free to use the Q&A or the chat to kind of ask any questions that you have. Cool. This isn't totally related, but I'm curious how you made $2,000 a month on Medium. On Medium, I just kept on writing and iterating. I applied a lot of the startup principles to this. So I thought a lot about, what is the unfair advantage I have to win, and like write about this. In my case, I'm very immersed in this space. I happen to have a lot of knowledge in this space because I live and breathe it every day. And I constantly just iterated and said, like, what are people interested in? And I now know that most of my audience wants something related to making good decisions and how to like apply that into startups, right? So my recent one, generated a bunch of money, but typically I think my articles generate anywhere. The ones that do well generate, about $400 or $500. If it doesn't, it bombs. It's pretty binary. Another question is, if you split between two kinds of decisions, for me, I'd like to lean into being a founder and also be a creative entrepreneur. They are different in nature. I'm not sure what that means, like being a founder and also a creative entrepreneur. Do you want to share what that means? I think I am able to invite you to the call. Yeah, if you're able to kind of clarify on the chat, I think that would be helpful. I'm not sure if I understand the question, so I want to understand so I can, actually do a good job in answering it. As we're looking into this, I think Pani, how did you go about testing your startup ideas? I think most of your job as a startup founder in the beginning, before you reach something called product market fit, which basically means you have now validated that the market or your users actually want this thing, is to run really meaningful experiments and try to get to what people care about. Typically what happens, the typical process is you try to go out to a set of users or people you just enjoy talking with and people you understand and try to understand a problem that they have. And then you go and try to solve that problem. You bring it to these guys back and say, hey, I solved your problem. Are you going to pay for it? And if they're willing to pay for it, then it's good. And you continue kind of doing these experiments, ideally in a market that's really, really big. So what you don't want to do is go after a market with like 1,000 people. You want to go with a really big market that's ideally growing very quickly with people who are willing to pay for your product. And that's kind of that's really the essence of all of this. I don't know how detailed you want the answer to this to be, but you could also go and, I mean, a lot of people do landing pages, but honestly, just doing good customer interviews is helpful. There's a good book called The Mom Test, which is like the Bible of user interviews for a lot of startup founders, and it helps you understand and get to the core of the problem, so you won't waste your time. So, for example, if I were to create a company that provides you coffee, what I do, like the type of question I wouldn't want to ask you is, hey, would you pay for my coffee product? That is probably like a really, really bad way to start a customer interview, because people tend to lie to you all the time, unintentionally, but they do. So the types of questions you would want to ask instead are something like, hey, how often do you drink coffee, if ever? And if they don't drink any coffee, they're just immediately not your customer, right? So, but if they do drink coffee, maybe like 3 times a week or 4 times a week or every single day, they're like, oh, really interesting. Like, what type of coffee do you drink? And you can kind of go through this rabbit hole. And if it turns out that, for example, this user drinks coffee every day, but the only reason they drink it every day is because it's offered for free at their company, again, it's questionable if they'd be willing to pay for your coffee product. So you want to have like a good set of interview techniques to get at the right problems and then start solving that problem. Cool. The other piece that was there is, you mentioned that there are a few jobs that have uncapped potential and floor downside. What are some of these career paths? I think you always want to look at the career paths and my signal is like, can it have an unlimited growth potential is typically it. Like, for example, usually when you join a very established company, it is challenging to make that happen. Although, a way around that is to create new departments or new things within that organization. But for example, when you're working at a company like, BCG or McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, there's a very structured way of how you get promoted, right? You have to put in X amount of years. You have to put in a bunch of these things. So the upside, as you know, is your base case is probably going to be really good. So like if you end up becoming, a couple years analyst, couple years associate, and then whatever, and you hit managing director at a Goldman or a KKR or any of these places, your base case is actually really good. But the upside beyond that is not that high, as in it's pretty capped. That's assuming you can hit your base case, right? Versus if you look at like an early stage company, joining an early stage company where you have a share of the company, you have a piece of it, and this company has a potential to go from like $50 million to like a $50 billion company. You can see how your upside is almost unlimited. This applies to the same thing with like being a creator. Like if you're a good creator, look at Mr. Beast, you can look at any of these guys. There's no real cap on how many audience you can capture. Like no one is artificially saying you cannot go beyond this. And typically those are the good signals I try to lean into. Again, you can say the same thing about music, same thing about writing. You can say the same thing about really anything where there's nothing artificially holding you back. And that's like a good way to think about that. I think in the chat, there was one more question. How do you narrow down ideas when you think of career choices? I have a business and 2 other ideas I'd like to do. I can morph into each other, but like I'm all over the place sometimes. Here, I think you want to run a bunch of experiments and kind of test which ones stick. Usually when founders have ideas, it's usually bad. In fact, I don't think there's like very few founders who've ever said, this is what I'm doing. And then they do just that and then grow it into a business. That almost never happens. Think of having good ideas as a good starting point to test things. And that test bed might be setting your users or setting a product and then testing it out. And in startup world, we have something called minimum viable product, or an MVP. Like what's the minimal thing that you can invest to go test and see what this idea is? I'll give you a example. Someone might say, hey, I want to build like a marketplace that helps connect people to a nail salon or something. So I think instead of going out and building the tech to go do that, you can literally just go to consumers and try to understand how they schedule it today, and you can manually schedule it for them. You can become their like executive assistant and do the scheduling. And are people willing to pay for that? And if you are, you can go build it. So I think that's if you have a couple of ideas in mind, try to go test it and see which one sticks. And if there's one that sticks, really try to double down on that experience there. Cool. Hopefully that's helpful. My career transition from best to different years and 100% still applicable. There's another question about career transition is forecasting different scenarios if you're not 100% sure of the change still applicable. So when you think about a career by transition, hopefully like it's out of your own choice. If that's the case, I think the same holds. Like, what's the absolute upside you'd have from transitioning into a new career, right? Let's say you were a account manager and now you want to try to get into product, right? So, but you're like a manager as an account manager, but then you have to join as like an analyst or like an entry level product development. So you can like forecast all of these things out. It's like, okay, what's the cap on staying at this account management job? Like, what's the realistic upside that I can get from it? What's the base case? What's the downside? And do the same thing with this entry level product development. Presumably, you want to make a transition because you think the upside is probably higher. And that upside doesn't have to be even financial. The upside can be like very much, do I get more time to spend on my own or with my family, right? Like the upside differs based on like what you want and who you are. So I think you can still run the same exercise into a career transition and then adapt as you get more information, right? Like as you start that job, you'll get more information and you can reforecast things. And if it turns out that you were absolutely wrong, well, then like maybe it's time for another decision. Cool. From Jackie, what does your time allowance per week look like? It seems you simultaneously pollute an Oxford degree, a startup, medium writing, and other side hustles. Do you dedicate 1 day per week schoolwork? That's a good question. While I was at Oxford, Oxford splits into semesters into 3, so there's trimesters. In the first semester, I did not think about startups at all. I said, I'm just going to completely immerse myself. So I did like rowing, I did debate, I like went to class and did all of these things. And then in the second semester is when I said, I think that's January or February is the start date. That's when I started thinking about a startup idea. I incorporated that into it. So I was only doing 2 things. I was pursuing an Oxford degree and then like going to class and then raising money and building my company at the time. And then as soon as I was done, I was only focused on my startup for like a good year. And then I started medium writing. And again, I only write once a month. So I think that's roughly comes down to about 5 hours a week. So about 1 week, so about an hour a week or so is how much I spend on medium writing. And usually it's not forced, right? Because there's tons of ideas in the backlog. I just spend the hour or so to kind of really go do that. I don't think I have any other, the only other ones that I do is I occasionally do expert calls. So I don't know if you're aware of GLG or Alpha Sites. They ask you for a call for an hour with one of their clients, and then you get paid to talk for an hour. They pay pretty well, but I don't do this very frequently. So I think those are the only 2 things. I'm working on my startup, and I do medium on the side a little bit, and that's about it. Cool. All right, I think we have 5 more minutes. Happy to take any more questions, but if there isn't, we don't need to drag this on. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's it. So happy to chat about any of the career stuff. I have my Medium on here. I have so if you want to reach out, I also have my personal website on Medium, so you can feel free to reach out and if you have any other questions. But otherwise, it looks like there are no more questions on both the Q&A and the chat. How do you usually plan out your immediate next step? Yeah, for immediate next step, I'll take this as the last one, and then maybe you can wrap up. Like by immediate next steps, if you just mean executing, I think it's just working out the logistics. For example, like I knew that I needed to give a notice to my previous job before I quit, right? So I knew that I need to bake that into my timeline, and then I knew that I had a start date for my grad degree at a certain point. So I just needed to match all of those things together and make sure the logistics are there. But I think this is all just a matter of execution, right? And then when it comes to like starting your startup, it's just you're constantly iterating and running experiments. That's literally your job before you find product market fit. So that's typically how I tend to approach things when it comes to immediate next steps. There's a question from Isabel, but I'm not sure if it's cut off. It says, I'm part of a startup. Saw your article on Medium about not joining one. I'm not sure if that's a statement or a question, but I think otherwise we are good. I'll give it one more minute for any other questions. Otherwise, happy to wrap up. It's pretty late in the eastern coast, so. Oh, okay. So Isabel to assess the risk. I mean, if you've read the article, I think it should be pretty clear. But basically, the article talks about, again, how to think like an investor. And what a lot of people mistakenly think is if you just join a startup, you have this uncapped upside, which is not actually true. So I'll just briefly talk about this is, let's say you get shares of a company, of a series A company. If you join even as a mid-level, like non-technical person, you'll maybe get 0.1% of the company. That's before your shares get diluted and so on and so forth. So that means when this company becomes a billion-dollar company, you will end up with $1 million, right? And it takes, let's say this company takes about 10 years, which is not uncommon for a startup to hit $1 billion mark. After 10 years, you're getting $1 million. It's $100,000 over 10 years without adjustment for dilution or inflation or any of those other things. So you should really think about what your upside actually is. And for it to be meaningful, maybe you need the company to become a 10, 20, $30 billion company. How is the company going to kind of get there? The other thing that you should think about is like, is this company going to survive? That's especially if it's an early stage startup, like how much cash are they burning? How much cash is that in the bank? And basically, am I at the risk of getting fired or the company shutting down, which is usually like the big downside for an early stage company. And then the final piece is like, try to actually understand what you're betting on. So if you need this company to become a $10 billion company, for example, like try to figure out what it takes to get there. For example, like let's say a company of that in that industry trades on what's called a 10x EV to revenue multiple. That means based on their revenue, your valuation is 10x that. To become a $10 billion company, your company needs to generate $1 billion. If your company is selling a software that's $20 a month, like you need millions of users, like millions of companies to be onboarded to get to even that revenue, never mind like a break-even point. So just do the basic math and see like, do I believe this company will get there? And I think that should be sufficient to get started here. Cool. Thanks for joining the call. I know it's late. It was a pleasure meeting everybody, and I wish there was like a more interactive sort of way to do this, but thanks for taking the time and all your questions, and hopefully